9 months of silence ended in one scream that changed the convent forever. Welcome to Stories TH. Today's story is not just heartbreaking, it's a call for justice. If you've ever believed that truth will prevail, this tale will speak to your soul. Don't forget to like and subscribe to Stories TH so you won't miss more powerful stories like this. Mary had always believed that faith could carry her through anything. Her days in the convent were quiet, routine, and devoted until the morning her body betrayed her with a sudden wave of nausea. Collapsing beside the ancient stone well, she clutched her stomach, confused and afraid. The whispers began soon after. Sister Anna, her closest friend, tried to offer comfort, but even she couldn't make sense of what was happening. Mary knew one thing for certain: she had never been with anyone. Yet her body was changing, and fear crept in like a shadow that wouldn't lift. The other nuns noticed too. Their glances turned from concern to suspicion, and their whispers turned sharp. Mary's protests fell on deaf ears. When Reverend Mother Teresa called her in, her voice was cold, and her accusations sharper than the chill of the chapel stones. "Who is the father of the child in your womb?" The question echoed like a curse, and Mary's world began to unravel. She could only shake her head, sobbing, "I don't know." But no one believed her. From that moment, Mary was no longer a sister of the convent. She was an outcast, forced to kneel on the cold ground for hours, her body weakening, her soul breaking. They stripped her of dignity, food, warmth, and kindness. They called her a liar, a sinner, a disgrace. But worst of all, they left her alone. In the dark, where prayers once brought peace, only silence remained. Yet, through the suffocating shame and aching isolation, Mary clung to one fragile truth: she had done nothing wrong. Her body was a mystery even to her, and her faith, though battered, still flickered like a dying flame. Her tears soaked the chapel stones, but not a single soul offered mercy. The shame deepened when her pleas were dismissed, when even Sister Anna began to keep her distance, torn between obedience and compassion. As Mary knelt under the Virgin Mary's gaze, her thoughts spiraled. Was this punishment? Had she been chosen to suffer for something unknown? And then came the voice, deep, cold, from the shadows of her mind or the hallway outside. She couldn't be sure. Father Isaac, a man of God, with eyes that saw too much. "Because you were sleeping very deeply that night," he whispered. Horror clutched her heart. She couldn't remember anything. But those words, his cruel certainty, plunged her into panic. Was it possible? Was he the one who took everything from her? The realization hit her like a blow. No one would believe her, not against a man with power and reverence. Her voice was too soft, her suffering too silent. The truth, so twisted, would only tighten the noose of her punishment. But inside her, life stirred. Her child, innocent, unseen. She would live for that child, even if the world rejected them both. She would endure. The floor of the chapel became her prison, the whispers her tormentors. And yet, every morning she rose, scraped her knees on the stone, and whispered to her unborn child, "Mommy is still here." No one believed her, but she believed in love, in truth, in some kind of mercy. The Reverend Mother had cast her out, but Mary would not abandon herself. The fear, the anxiety, the betrayal, none of it could erase her spirit. She didn't understand how she became pregnant, but she knew the life within her deserved better. So she stood, and knelt, and stood again, until the world broke open around her, until that day would come when the truth clawed its way out from the darkness. 2. The days following Mary's exile within the convent felt like slow, burning torture. No longer a sister in the eyes of those around her, she had become a ghost, trapped in stone walls. She was forced to kneel for hours each day in front of the chapel, her knees scraping against the cold, unforgiving floor until they bled. The Reverend Mother decreed she was not worthy to join the other nuns in prayer or meals. Her punishment was to suffer alone spiritually and physically until she confessed a sin she didn't understand. Her meals were reduced to stale, dry bread, and even water became a rare mercy. Whispers followed her wherever she went. She defiled this place. God will punish us if we allow her to stay. The scorn cut deeper than the hunger or the cold. Mary tried to keep her head down, to survive each day, to breathe and to pray, but her body grew weaker and her spirit more fragile. At night, she curled up in the storage room assigned as her new quarters, shivering under a thin blanket as wind crept through the cracked walls. The darkness whispered lies to her, that she was alone, that God had turned away, that no one would ever believe her. But worse than the cold or the hunger was the aching loneliness. The absence of kindness, of compassion, made her question her own sanity. Was she truly cursed? Had she unknowingly sinned? The sharp stares of the others seemed to say yes. Even Sister Anna, once her friend, became distant, torn between duty and her conscience. Mary's only comfort was the tiny movement in her belly, the silent proof that she was not entirely alone. But that life inside her, too, became a reason for torment. The child, seen by others as a mark of shame, was her only light in an otherwise endless night. The cruelty intensified. Sister Margaret and Sister Evelyn made sure of that. They pushed her down, poured cold water over her head in the early mornings, and taunted her like bullies in a schoolyard. Still dare to show your face? She thinks she's still a nun. Mary tried to speak, to plead, but they silenced her with glares and threats. She learned that no matter what she said, it would be twisted, weaponized. There was no use in defending herself anymore. Her only focus was survival for herself and the child growing inside her. Even as her body ached, as her bones felt brittle from malnutrition, she whispered silent prayers to her unborn baby. Hold on. Mommy is here. But her hope wore thin. When Father Isaac appeared in her cell, his presence chilled her to the core. The way he looked at her, his calm demeanor, the glint in his eye, it all confirmed what she had feared, that he had done something unspeakable. His whispered taunts echoed in her head for days. You were sleeping so deeply that night. No one will believe you. That was the cruelest part of it all, the gaslighting, the weaponization of power. He knew he could say and do anything, and she had no voice, no allies. Her word against his, a priest, a man of God. She was just a filthy nun, cast out and broken. Her pregnancy became a target of mockery and condemnation. Her innocence was irrelevant. Every judgment had already been made. The Reverend Mother, once someone Mary respected, became her greatest tormentor, cold, rigid, unrelenting. She forbade Mary from eating with the others, ordered her to clean the kitchen, the floors, and even the outhouses, all while her body ached from exhaustion and malnourishment. When Mary was caught talking to Sister Anna, just begging to be believed, she was punished further, forced to kneel in the courtyard through an entire freezing night. Her lips turned blue, her knees swelled, and her bones ached with each gust of icy wind, but she endured, because she had no choice. She had to survive. Days blurred into nights. Her body withered, and she lost track of time. They wanted her to break, to confess to a lie, to disappear into despair. And she nearly did. But that life inside her, the tiny heartbeat she sometimes imagined she could feel against her own chest, kept her from giving up. She began to whisper to it like a prayer. You are not a sin. You are my hope. Her belly swelled, her strength faded, but her will remained. She could not die, not while her baby needed her. Then came the breaking point. She collapsed during her chores. No one helped. She lay on the cold floor, her hands trembling. That night, the pain came like a tidal wave. Labor. Alone. Forgotten. She screamed, but the convent walls remained silent. And still, she pushed. In that moment of agony, soaked in sweat and tears, she brought her child into the world. Alone, but not broken. And when she saw the birthmark on her child's chest, shaped like a cross, something shifted in the air. A hush fell over the convent as word spread. Could it be a sign from God? Could they have been wrong all along? Mary clutched her newborn tightly, exhausted, but filled with a quiet fire. The child was here. She had survived. And now, so had Mary. The truth had been smothered beneath layers of silence, shame, and blind obedience. But the day of reckoning had finally arrived. Mary, frail and trembling, sat in the corner of the cold convent storage room, clutching her newborn child. Her body was still reeling from the agony of giving birth alone, but her spirit, once crushed under the weight of injustice, now burned with quiet determination. The cries of her child pierced through the thick walls of the convent, louder than any prayer ever whispered. When the other nuns arrived, the sight that greeted them stopped their hearts. There, in Mary's arms, was a tiny baby boy bearing a birthmark in the unmistakable shape of a cross over his chest. Whispers rose like smoke. Was it a sign from God? Had they been wrong to condemn her? Even the most skeptical eyes widened in horror and confusion. The Reverend Mother, who had once led the campaign of punishment against Mary with an iron heart, stood frozen. Her lips moved, but no words came. What could she say in the face of such divine contradiction? The silence didn't last long. Murmurs turned into murmurs of guilt. Guilt turned into outrage. And finally, one brave voice, Sister Anna, stepped forward. "We were wrong," Sister Anna said, her voice cracking but unwavering. "We let our fear blind us." The words hung heavy in the air, echoing off stone walls like thunder. Reverend Mother Teresa tried to reclaim authority, hissing about temptation and sin, but it was too late. The tides had shifted. Then came the final blow. Sister Anna reached into her sleeve and pulled out a small notebook, a secret she had held close for weeks. In front of the stunned convent, she read, "On the night Mary fell ill, she was given water after Mass. Within minutes, she lost consciousness. Gasps rippled through the room. Father Isaac, standing near the doorway with a shadow over his face, suddenly stiffened. The walls seemed to lean in on him. Sister Anna's gaze locked with his. "You drugged her," she said calmly. "You took advantage of her vulnerability, and you made her carry the shame while hiding behind your robe." Father Isaac lunged toward her, trying to grab the notebook, but Sister Evelyn and Sister Margaret moved faster. They stood in his path, faces hard with fury. "What did you do to her?" Evelyn demanded. "Swear to God that you're innocent." But the priest, once so powerful, now stammered. His silence screamed louder than a confession. "You're the monster," Sister Margaret said, "and we let you walk among us." The room exploded into chaos, gasps, accusations, cries of disbelief and regret. The nuns began to weep, realizing they had allowed evil to live in their midst while condemning the innocent. The Reverend Mother tried to hold on to power, but her defenses crumbled. "I didn't know," she whispered, though even her voice trembled with guilt. "I only did what I thought was right." "You abandoned her," Sister Anna snapped. "You let her suffer while the real villain sat at our table." Sister Evelyn stepped forward, her voice icy. "You enabled this. You turned this convent into a prison." One by one, the nuns turned their backs on Reverend Mother Teresa. No longer was she a symbol of spiritual leadership. She had become a symbol of denial, fear, and pride. Her pleas for forgiveness fell on deaf ears. "You were supposed to protect us," one nun said through tears. "Instead, you protected a predator." As the truth poured out, Mary held her baby tightly. Her face was pale, her eyes sunken with exhaustion, but her expression was no longer one of despair. It was peace, quiet, steady peace that came from finally being believed. Sister Anna knelt beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "You are brave," she whispered. "You survived what no one should have to endure." Mary leaned into her, tears falling silently. "I thought I was alone," she murmured, "but God was always listening." By the end of the night, Father Isaac was bound and handed over to authorities. The Reverend Mother, too, was stripped of her title and expelled from the convent. Justice, long overdue, had finally arrived. The other nuns gathered around Mary, tears in their eyes. "We are so sorry," they said. "We were blind." Mary, who had every right to turn away, looked at them with tired eyes full of grace. "I forgive you," she said, "but never forget what silence can do." In the days that followed, the convent was no longer a place of fear. It became a sanctuary of change. The leadership was rebuilt, the rules reshaped. The community was no longer built on silence, but on truth. Mary chose not to stay. With her child in her arms and Sister Anna by her side, she stepped beyond the convent gates to begin a new life, free, healed, and empowered. Her story, once buried in shame, now lived as a testament to courage and the power of exposing the truth, even when no one wants to hear it. Because in the end, the truth doesn't need approval. It only needs light. Mary's world, once defined by prayer, peace, and quiet devotion, had turned into a living nightmare. Branded a sinner without trial, condemned without evidence, she became the target of cruel whispers and merciless stares inside the very walls that once felt like a sanctuary. The cold convent, with its towering stone walls and hollow chapel bells, had become her prison. Day after day, she was forced to kneel for hours in the bitter cold, denied sleep in her own bed, and shoved into a storage room where rats scurried along the edges of the walls. Her meals were reduced to scraps dry bread, barely enough to keep her upright. Yet still, Mary did not collapse. She refused. Her knees bled from the endless hours she spent in prayer, but she never stopped. "God," she whispered under her breath, "if I am wrong, show me. But if I'm right, give me the strength to endure." Each prayer felt heavier than the last, not because she lacked faith, but because it became harder to believe that anyone divine or human still saw her as a person. Yet, deep within her, behind the veil of exhaustion and the bruises left by harsh hands, flickered a quiet fire. She could not fall, not now, not with a child growing inside her. That child was her anchor, the only warmth left in a world turned to ice. The worst part wasn't the physical pain, it was the isolation. Not a single soul dared to speak to her except Sister Anna, a young nun whose soft heart was constantly reprimanded. The others avoided Mary like she carried a disease. Sister Margaret spat insults at her whenever they crossed paths, and Sister Evelyn's condescending laughter cut deeper than any whip. Even when Mary begged for anyone to believe her, the Reverend Mother remained cold and unmoved. "You are not to be seen as one of us," she declared before the other nuns, making it clear that Mary had no place at their table, no right to share in their worship, and certainly no permission to be treated with dignity. She was banished to eat alone, kneel alone, sleep alone. The very breath she took was treated as an offense to their sacred space. But Mary would not give them the satisfaction of breaking. Every time she collapsed in the cold, she whispered prayers through chattering teeth. Every time her stomach growled in hunger, she placed a trembling hand over her unborn child and promised, "I will protect you, no matter what." When they locked her in the holding room for days, feeding her nothing but silence and cruelty, Mary curled in the corner, shivering, holding tight to her crucifix, and prayed for deliverance. Even as her strength faded and her legs swelled, she held on. She didn't know how long she could endure, but she had to try for her child, for herself, for the truth. Then came the night that would change everything. The storm outside roared, wind crashing against the stone walls as Mary writhed on the cold floor, the pain of labor tearing through her like fire. No one came. No one cared. She was completely alone. Her screams echoed in silence, swallowed by the uncaring halls of the convent. But just when she thought she would pass out, a cry pierced the darkness, not her own, but the cry of her newborn child. Against all odds, Mary had given birth alone, in agony, in a room meant to crush her spirit. She looked at the tiny baby boy in her arms, tears streaking her face, and for the first time in months, she smiled. Then, as she looked closer, her breath caught in her throat, a birthmark, a small, perfect cross on her son's chest. The morning after, the convent awoke not to bells or hymns, but to gasps and whispers. Nuns gathered, their expressions shifting from scorn to shock as they stared at the child, at the unmistakable sign. A symbol that perhaps God had not abandoned Mary after all. But the Reverend Mother was not ready to accept such a truth. She called it a trick, a temptation, a test. "This child is no miracle," she hissed. "It's a stain on this holy place." Mary, weary but unafraid, stood her ground. "You left me to suffer, but still I survived. And this child, this innocent life, you have no right to condemn him." The truth had begun to shake the walls of their lies. Rumors gave way to questions. Questions gave way to confessions. One by one, nuns like Sister Anna and even Sister Evelyn began to speak, realizing that their silence had fueled the fire of injustice. The truth Mary had begged for had finally begun to rise. But through it all, through the hunger, humiliation, isolation, and childbirth in captivity, Mary never lost her love, her strength, or her faith. Her story became one of survival, not just for herself, but for the child she brought into a world determined to erase them both. And in that quiet miracle, the world was forced to confront its cruelty and reckon with its silence. For weeks, Mary clung to confusion and prayer, trying to make sense of the impossible. Her body had betrayed her, growing heavier with a life she never understood creating. Every attempt to speak out had been met with ridicule, punishment, and accusations. But nothing could prepare her for the moment the shadows finally spoke, and the voice was one she had trusted. That night, as she lay on the freezing floor of the convent storage room, her limbs weak from starvation and despair, a whisper broke through the silence like a blade. "You were sleeping very deeply that night," the voice said coldly. Her heart froze. She looked up, and there stood Father Isaac, his cassock swaying slightly as he stepped into the faint candlelight. In his eyes wasn't the compassion of a priest, but the calculated glint of a man who enjoyed control. Her mind raced. What did he mean? Was he mocking her confusion? And then, like a trapdoor opening beneath her, everything made sense at once. The nausea, the bleeding knees, the shame, the child. Her eyes widened, tears already brimming as he smirked and leaned closer. "I made sure you would never remember." It felt like the ground had disappeared beneath her. Her hands clutched her swollen belly as if trying to protect it from a truth too dark to face. She had been drugged, used, and now she was being punished for a sin she never chose. Her breath caught as Father Isaac's voice dripped with cruelty. "Do you think they'll believe you? A pregnant nun with no memory? Or me, a man of God?" His words carved through her like a knife, every syllable confirming the worst betrayal imaginable. She was not just being ostracized, she was being silenced by the very person who had broken her. And no one would believe her, not in a world that chose titles over truth, robes over righteousness. Mary collapsed to the floor after he left, her body trembling with grief, shame, and rage. She had no memory of that night, and now she understood why. But how could she fight back against someone who held all the power, who had the protection of the convent, the favor of the Reverend Mother, and the ears of every nun? She buried her face in her hands and sobbed silently, the sound muffled by stone walls that never listened. But in her chest, beneath the sorrow, something else stirred a seed of defiance. If no one else would protect her child, she would. If no one else would speak the truth, she would find a way to bring it to light. She had no weapons, no allies, no voice. But she had the truth, and maybe that was enough. The next day, Father Isaac acted as though nothing had happened. He preached, he blessed. He dined in comfort, while Mary was denied even the dignity of sitting at a shared table. But now, when he passed her, she no longer looked down in shame. She stared back, not because she wasn't afraid she was, but because fear was no longer her master. The truth was, and she would not let it be buried. When Sister Anna found her later that evening, her eyes swollen from another night of pain, Mary finally whispered, "I know who did this." Sister Anna paled. "Who?" Mary hesitated, her voice cracking. "Father Isaac." The name hung in the air like poison. Sister Anna stepped back, hands trembling. "Are you sure?" "He told me. He drugged me." Mary expected doubt, expected to see Anna walk away like everyone else, but Anna didn't. She sat beside her, silent for a long time, then nodded. "I believe you." Those 3 words were everything. In a world that had stripped her of humanity, believing her was the first act of restoration. Together, they formed a fragile plan. Sister Anna would begin keeping notes, quietly gathering observations, details, anything that might help them. It was dangerous. If discovered, Anna could be expelled or worse, but she was resolute. "If we don't expose him, he'll do this again, and again." For the first time, Mary felt something flicker in her chest. Not just hope, but power. The days dragged on, each one a battlefield of silence and pretense. Mary endured more punishments, forced to sleep in the cold, to pray for hours without food, to kneel in shame while others passed judgment. But beneath the suffering was a purpose, a mission. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was preparing. And when Sister Anna finally showed her the notebook, filled with dates and times and whispers, Mary wept. It wasn't much, but it was proof, a seed of truth growing in the dark. Then came the confrontation. In front of the other nuns, Sister Anna read from the notebook, her voice trembling but strong. She recited the night Mary had been drugged. Father Isaac lunged for her, but it was too late. The veil had been lifted. Gasps echoed through the chapel. The Reverend Mother turned pale. Some nuns cried. Others turned away in shame. Mary stood silently at the center of it all, her baby in her arms, her body still bruised, but her spirit finally vindicated. She had been used, silenced, abandoned, but she had not been broken. And now, the man who thought he was untouchable faced judgment not just from God, but from the world that had finally seen her truth. 6. Mary had braved the cold of rejection, the agony of betrayal, and the soul-crushing silence of injustice, but nothing could have prepared her for what happened the night her child was born. Alone in the dark cell of the convent, drenched in sweat and shivering from the pain of labor, she screamed into the emptiness, her voice lost under the sound of rain hammering the stone walls. No midwife, no comfort, no helping hands, just agony and God. Her body trembled as another contraction surged through her like a storm. Her strength was nearly gone, her breath shallow. And just when she thought she would slip into the void, a fragile cry pierced the darkness. Her eyes flew open, her hands scrambling across the floor. There, against all odds, lay a newborn baby, her son, alive, breathing, crying, a miracle. Tears spilled from her eyes, but then her gaze froze. There, on the baby's tiny chest, was a clear, unmistakable mark, a cross. Her heart skipped a beat. It wasn't a shadow or trick of light, it was real, a birthmark shaped like a perfect symmetrical cross. Mary clutched the child to her chest, her breath catching. What did it mean? Was this a sign? Suddenly, footsteps thundered down the hall. The door burst open. The light from the corridor spilled into the room, and gasps echoed behind it. A nun screamed. Another dropped to her knees. "Oh God, look at the mark," whispered Sister Margaret, her voice trembling. The Reverend Mother entered, her eyes wide in disbelief. She stood frozen in the doorway, pale as parchment. "This can't be," she muttered, her voice barely audible. The room filled with whispers, some terrified, some awed. "Is it possible? A sign from God? Have we made a terrible mistake?" The weight of their guilt and cruelty now stood before them in flesh and blood, small, innocent, and marked by something divine. Mary, exhausted but defiant, held her baby tightly, shielding him from their gaze. She was no longer silent. "This child is innocent," she said, her voice soft but unyielding. "He is not a sin. He is a soul, and he is mine." The nuns stepped back, ashamed to meet her eyes. For so long, they had cast stones without truth, declared her impure without evidence. They let fear override faith, cruelty override compassion. And now, the child in her arms had shattered all their lies. "You can punish me," Mary continued, her lips trembling, "but do not dare lay a hand on him." The Reverend Mother, shaken, turned her back. "This is not a miracle," she hissed, struggling to regain control. "This is temptation. This child is not holy. He is a test." Mary shook her head, refusing to be silenced again. "God would not bless sin with such a sign," she said, her voice breaking. "He would bless truth." Sister Anna stepped forward, tears streaming down her cheeks. "She's right," she said. "We were wrong." Her words shattered the air like glass. The other nuns looked at each other, horror dawning in their eyes. Sister Evelyn wept openly. "We let our pride blind us. We were supposed to protect one another. Instead, we abandoned her to her pain." Then, a voice from the back of the room cut through the tension like a blade. You were not blind. You were deceived. Father Isaac stood tall, but this time his voice shook. Don't listen to her, he said, pointing at Mary. She's manipulating you all. But the fear in his voice betrayed him. Sister Anna stepped forward and raised a notebook high above her head. We have proof. Records of the night Mary was drugged. You did this to her. The room gasped. The spell of his authority shattered. The nuns turned toward him, eyes wide, expressions shifting from confusion to revulsion. You said she sinned, someone whispered. You were the sinner, said another. The Reverend Mother tried to speak, to reclaim authority, but her words crumbled in her mouth. We let him lead us, Sister Evelyn cried, and we let her suffer. Mary stood silently, clutching her baby. She didn't feel triumphant, only heavy with sorrow, but also, at long last, peace. He will not hurt anyone again, she said softly, because the truth has come to light. That night, the convent changed forever. Father Isaac was taken away in chains, the Reverend Mother stripped of her power. The nuns who had once turned their backs now knelt before Mary and her child, not in worship, but in apology. Please, Sister Margaret whispered, tears in her eyes, forgive us. Mary looked down at her baby's sleeping face and then back at the women who had nearly destroyed her. Forgiveness, she whispered, is the only way forward. And so she gave it, not because they deserved it, but because she refused to carry the weight of their sin in her heart any longer. The miracle that had come from her suffering was not just her child, but her own transformation. She had survived hell, and now she would walk into the light, not alone, but with her son, her strength, and her faith intact. The walls that once imprisoned Mary had finally crumbled, not with fire or fury, but with truth, and the weight of countless silences shattered in a single moment of reckoning. As the early morning sun broke through the stained glass windows of Mount Carmel Convent, its light cast golden beams onto the very floor where Mary had once knelt in isolation, now surrounded by those who had once condemned her. Only a week had passed since the night her child was born, the night that exposed not just a holy miracle, but the darkness lurking in holy robes. The cross-shaped birthmark on her son's chest had stirred something deeper than fear or awe. It forced every soul in the convent to look inward. It exposed lies, it unmasked the powerful, and it turned whispers into cries for justice. Father Isaac, the man once seen as God's voice within those sacred walls, now stood handcuffed, his robes disheveled, his face no longer shrouded in holiness, but in shame. Sister Evelyn's trembling hands had held the notebook that sealed his fate records, detailing how Mary had been drugged after midnight mass, stripped of memory, and blamed for a sin she never committed. His desperate denial collapsed under the weight of proof, and for the first time, the devil wore a collar. Even the Reverend Mother, once revered and feared, stood frozen as the truth unraveled around her. Her voice, once thunderous with divine judgment, now quivered with panic. I only did what was right for the convent, she whispered, but no one believed her anymore. You followed your own will, Sister Anna had cried out that day, not God's. It was Sister Anna who had stood alone when no one else would. It was she who had risked everything to smuggle keys, open locked doors, and offer Mary the first thread of hope she had held in months. It was her courage that inspired others to speak up, to realize their silence had enabled cruelty in the name of purity. And when Mary had finally spoken, not with rage, but with grace, her words echoed like gospel through every soul that had once turned away from her. You can punish me, but do not touch my child. He is not my shame. He is my salvation. In the days that followed, everything changed. Father Isaac was removed by the authorities, escorted out beneath the eyes of the very sisters he had once manipulated. His cries of innocence rang hollow in the chapel halls he once ruled. The Reverend Mother was stripped of her title and ordered to leave the convent, her name no longer whispered with reverence, but as a reminder of what happens when pride disguises itself as piety. The remaining sisters, led by Sister Anna and Sister Evelyn, began to transform Mount Carmel into something new, not just a place of worship, but of kindness, healing, and humility. The chapel no longer echoed with judgment, but with song. The cold stone corridors that once swallowed the sound of Mary's cries now carried laughter, softness, and honest prayer. A new spirit had taken root, and it grew with each act of forgiveness. But Mary knew her path no longer belonged behind convent walls. One morning, dressed in a simple robe with her child wrapped tightly against her chest, she stood at the convent gate, her eyes fixed on the horizon. Sister Anna stood beside her, her face a mixture of pride and sorrow. "Do you really want to leave?" she asked. Mary nodded, her heart steady. "I need to begin again," she replied. "Someplace where my son will never grow up under shameful eyes or fear cloaked in faith." Sister Anna gently touched Mary's hand. "You are going to be a wonderful mother," she said, her voice breaking. Mary smiled, tears shimmering in her eyes. "Only because I had someone believe in me when no one else would." With that, they embraced tight and silent, as if letting go was the hardest part. Mary turned, holding her baby close, and walked beyond the convent gates. No more chains, no more torment, no more being defined by lies whispered in holy corridors. Her steps were slow but purposeful. Every footfall was a declaration. "I am still here. I am still standing. I am not what you made me suffer for. And this child, he is light. He is proof that suffering can give birth to grace." She did not know where the road would lead, but for the first time and forever, it didn't matter. She was free. Behind her, the convent stood quiet forever, marked by the truth it once tried to hide. Inside, the sisters knelt not to condemn, but to repent. They prayed not for appearances, but for wisdom. Mary's story became a lesson, not a secret. It was shared in whispers, in tears, in sermons about strength and justice, and how easy it is to fall when fear silences compassion. They no longer saw her as the girl who defiled the convent. They saw her as the woman who saved it. And in that redemption, they found their own. As Mary walked into the rising sun, her son sleeping peacefully against her chest, she knew the world was wide, uncertain, and sometimes cruel, but it was also filled with beginnings, and this time she would write her own story, one filled not with chains, but with courage, not with judgment, but with love. Mary had once walked the stone halls of the convent with reverent silence, her steps gentle, her eyes lowered, her faith unwavering. But that morning, as she stood at the threshold of Mount Carmel Convent, child in her arms and dawnlight glowing on her tear-streaked cheeks, she didn't feel like a nun. She felt like a mother, a survivor, a woman who had walked through the fire of injustice and come out whole, not unburned, but unbroken. The baby in her arms shifted, letting out a soft sigh. He was sleeping soundly, his tiny chest rising and falling against hers, and she pressed a kiss to his forehead. Behind her, the once sacred walls that had become her prison loomed large, but no longer felt imposing. She had faced their darkness and walked through it. Now, the only thing left was light. Inside the convent, silence was no longer a weapon. It was now a moment of reckoning. Just a week ago, Father Isaac the man, cloaked in religious authority, had ruled those halls with twisted power and manipulation. He had drugged Mary, violated her while she slept, and left her to bear the consequences in silence. For months, she had endured isolation, starvation, beatings, and public shame. But she hadn't broken. Her womb had become a battlefield, her faith her only armor. When her son was born, marked with a cross-shaped birthmark over his heart, the truth pierced through lies, like a blade through fog. The sisters who had once hurled insults now knelt in tearful repentance. The ones who had turned away from her pain now could no longer look away from the truth. They saw the miracle she had carried. They saw the face of innocence, and in that face, they saw their guilt. Sister Anna had been the first to stand up. She had risked everything to unlock the door to Mary's cell, to offer her kindness when cruelty had become the norm. Her courage ignited others. Sister Evelyn, Sister Margaret, and even some of the youngest nuns who realized too late that silence was complicity. And when Father Isaac had tried to deny his sins, Sister Anna presented the journal that chronicled the night Mary was drugged. He tried to flee, but the sisters, in unity, dragged him down and handed him to the authorities. He didn't go quietly. Evil rarely does. But justice doesn't whisper, it roars when finally unleashed. The Reverend Mother, who had presided over the convent with an iron will and unshakable pride, stood frozen as her empire crumbled. Her voice, once used to cast judgments and declare punishments, could no longer command respect. Her excuses that she acted out of duty, out of faith, fell flat. "You acted out of fear," Sister Evelyn had said, her voice low but sharp. "You let your fear of scandal destroy a life." In the end, the Reverend Mother was forced to leave the convent, her name no longer holy, her rule forever condemned. She had traded compassion for control and lost everything. But Mary didn't stay to watch their downfall. She didn't gloat. She didn't seek revenge. Her soul had no room for bitterness, only space for hope. That morning, when the gates opened and Sister Anna handed her a small bag of bread and a shawl for the baby, Mary smiled, not because she was escaping, but because she was finally beginning. "Where will you go?" Sister Anna had asked, eyes glistening. "I don't know," Mary replied softly, "but anywhere I go will be better than where I've been." The remaining sisters watched her from the chapel windows, their faces solemn, humbled. They knew her child wasn't a curse, but a revelation. He had revealed the cracks in their system, the rot behind the robes. He had shown them what they'd become and what they still could be. In Mary's suffering, they rediscovered their humanity. In her strength, they saw God again, not in rules or rituals, but in mercy and truth. Mary's feet touched the gravel path outside the gate, and she took her first free breath in what felt like a lifetime. The wind brushed her cheeks. Her son stirred. She looked down at him and whispered, "We're going to be okay." She didn't need to know where the road would lead. What mattered was that she was on it, walking away from a place that had buried her, and toward a world she would build with her own hands. One not shaped by fear, but by love, not shackled by shame, but uplifted by truth. Back inside, the convent began to change. The walls were the same, but the air felt lighter. The sisters prayed not to control, but to listen. They fasted not to punish, but to reflect. They had learned through Mary that faith without compassion is just noise, and that silence in the face of injustice is not peace, it is betrayal. Her story became a parable. Her name became a prayer. And every time the sun rose over Mount Carmel, the sisters remembered that redemption is real, that it begins with one voice saying, "No more." Mary's journey had not ended. It had only just begun. She had no riches, no map, no guarantees. But she had something greater. She had truth. She had her son. And she had her freedom. And sometimes that is enough to change the world. In a world that had turned its back on her, Mary held on to the only two things she had left: her faith and her child. Her body had been starved, her voice silenced, and her soul bruised by the very people who were supposed to protect her. But even in the bleakest nights, when the cold stone of the convent bit into her knees and no warmth remained in her world, she whispered to the life growing within her, "We will make it." She didn't know how, and she didn't know when, but she believed in the flickering flame of hope. And in the end, that hope became her greatest weapon. When her child came into the world alone, in a room filled with shadows and pain, Mary had nothing but her trembling body and a mother's love. The moment she saw the tiny figure lying beside her, the agony melted into awe. He was beautiful, innocent, alive. His chest rose and fell in rhythm with hers, but it was the mark on his chest, a delicate cross, clear as a sign from above, that changed everything. It wasn't just a birth, it was a reckoning. The door had burst open, voices rang out, and gasps filled the air. The nuns who had once called Mary a sinner, who had spat cruel words and condemned her, now stood frozen in front of a miracle. The birthmark, the undeniable symbol of divinity, shook them to their core. Even the cold, stone-hearted Reverend Mother Teresa was pale with disbelief. She had orchestrated Mary's torment, ordered her isolation, denied her pleas. But this, the birthmark, was beyond her control, beyond her explanations, and that terrified her. Sister Anna was the first to speak, her voice trembling with a mix of sorrow and rage. "We were wrong," she said, eyes wet. We let our fear blind us. We let judgment override love." Her words cracked something in the air. The other sisters, one by one, stepped forward. Sister Evelyn, once skeptical, now openly wept. "We called ourselves women of God, but we acted with cruelty. We let injustice live under this roof." Whispers grew louder, murmurs of shame, regret, and awakening. What they had done to Mary no longer looked like righteousness. It looked like evil, dressed in robes. And then came the final blow, the exposure of Father Isaac, the man who had hidden behind a priest's collar, who had whispered threats in the dark, who had denied everything was unmasked. Sister Anna, brave as ever, read from her secret notebook. The evidence was irrefutable. The night Mary lost consciousness after Mass, the water she drank, the timing of her mysterious symptoms, it all pointed to him. He tried to deny it, but the silence of his guilt was deafening. No longer could he hide behind the pulpit. He was dragged away, screaming, no longer a holy man, but a monster revealed. As for the Reverend Mother, her fall was just as brutal. Her authority, once unquestioned, crumbled in the face of truth. "You abandoned her," Sister Evelyn shouted. "You turned a house of faith into a house of fear." The sisters didn't whisper this time. They spoke with conviction. They demanded accountability. And when the Reverend Mother fell to her knees, it wasn't in prayer. It was in surrender. Her reign was over, her cruelty exposed. Mary, still weak from labor, held her child close as the room erupted in cries, confessions, and promises to rebuild. She didn't cry for revenge. She didn't scream for more punishment. She simply watched with quiet strength as justice bloomed like morning light over darkness. Her child, once called a curse, was now called a miracle, a blessing, a sign that love and truth will always find their way. In that sacred moment, Mary became more than a victim. She became a symbol of resilience. Her body had been broken, but not her spirit. Her voice had been muted, but not her truth. The women who once scorned her now stood humbled at her feet, begging forgiveness. And when she said, "I forgive you," it wasn't weakness. It was the ultimate act of strength. Because forgiveness doesn't erase the past, it releases its grip. The convent would never be the same. With Father Isaac gone and the Reverend Mother exiled, the remaining sisters pledged to change. No more cruelty in the name of faith. No more silence. They vowed to make the convent a place of healing, of love, of compassion. Mary's child would grow up not as a symbol of shame, but of hope. That day, when Mary stood in the sunlight just beyond the convent gates, she was no longer the broken girl they once knew. She was a mother, a warrior, a witness to the power of truth. She had brought down a system that thrived on silence, not with violence, but with unwavering belief in the light. And as she stepped forward, holding her son tight, she whispered, "This is just the beginning." After everything she had endured, the cold floors, the aching hunger, the unbearable loneliness, Mary never imagined she'd still be alive to witness this moment. The very walls that once echoed with judgment now trembled with whispers of redemption. What began as a private torment hidden in shadows had grown into a storm of reckoning, sweeping through Mount Carmel Convent like divine fire. The silence that had protected the cruel was broken, shattered by truth, courage, and the cries of a child born in solitude. Mary had never asked for vengeance. All she wanted was to be heard. But now the world was listening. The Reverend Mother, once untouchable in her austere authority, had finally been stripped of her power. Her robes, once symbols of piety, now clung to her like the remnants of a fallen empire. Her voice, which had once commanded fear and obedience, now cracked with desperation. "You've betrayed God," she shouted in a last bitter attempt to reclaim control. But no one listened. The nuns who had once stood behind her, eyes cast downward in complicit silence, now stepped forward, one by one, to face her. Sister Evelyn, trembling but resolute, raised her voice. "No, Mother. It was you who betrayed God when you let cruelty take his place." Her words struck like thunder, awakening courage in the hearts of those around her. And then there was Father Isaac, the man cloaked in righteousness, whose whispered threats had haunted Mary's nights, stood exposed before the convent, No longer a man of God, but a predator hiding in plain sight. His mask had slipped, and beneath it was not a shepherd, but a wolf. The proof, drawn from Sister Anna's hidden notebook, was undeniable. The date, the mass, the tampered water, every entry a nail in the coffin of his deception. When confronted, he sputtered, his authority crumbling. "You can't prove anything," he spat. But silence is a confession, when the eyes of the innocent look back without fear. He lunged for the evidence, but it was too late. Sister Evelyn held it high like a torch of justice, and the nuns stepped back not from fear, but from revulsion. It was a turning point none of them could ignore. The Mother Superior's cold grip on the convent was gone. Father Isaac, restrained by those who once bowed before him, was finally facing the judgment he had long evaded. But in their place did not rise chaos or vengeance. Instead, a new spirit moved through the convent, one of truth, humility, and a long overdue sense of justice. The sisters, once bound by fear, began to speak, to question, to reflect. Tears flowed freely, not out of guilt alone, but out of grief for what they had allowed to happen in the name of tradition, obedience, and blind faith. Mary, holding her newborn son, stood at the center of it all. The child once thought to be a curse had become a beacon. His birthmark, shaped like a cross, was not just a symbol, but a mirror, reflecting everything the convent had become and everything it needed to change. The sisters knelt before Mary not in worship, but in apology. Their whispers turned into pledges. "We were wrong. We failed you. Please forgive us." And Mary, who had been beaten, starved, and cast aside, chose mercy. "I forgive you," she said softly, her voice carrying more power than any sermon ever delivered from that chapel. In that moment, forgiveness became revolution. What followed in the weeks ahead was nothing short of transformation. The convent no longer felt like a prison. Rooms that had once echoed with condemnation were filled with songs of healing. The cold stone floors were warmed with acts of kindness. Meals were shared, not withheld. Prayer became an act of love, not punishment. The sisters worked together to reform the structure that had once failed them all. Walls were painted, but more importantly, the walls around their hearts were torn down. There was laughter again, soft, uncertain at first, but growing stronger. For the first time, the convent was truly holy. As for Mary, she made a decision of her own. She had walked through the valley of despair and emerged with her child in her arms and strength in her heart. She chose to leave not out of fear, but in pursuit of something greater, freedom. Sister Anna, the only one who had risked everything for her, stood at the gate. "Are you sure?" she asked. Mary smiled. "Yes. I want my son to grow up in a world where compassion isn't punished, where truth isn't silenced." They embraced, and Mary stepped beyond the convent walls, sunlight washing over her like a blessing. Behind her, the gates closed not with finality, but with peace. Mount Carmel Convent had changed forever. The Reverend Mother was gone. Father Isaac was facing trial. But more than that, a new generation of sisters had risen, women who had once turned away, now vowing to never again forsake the vulnerable. They would be protectors, not punishers, healers, not judges. And in their chapel, beneath the stained glass that had witnessed so much pain, they carved new words into the stone. "Let no one suffer in silence." Mary's story wasn't one of perfect justice. Scars remained. But it was a story of hope forged in suffering, of light born in darkness. Her resilience sparked a revolution that none of them would ever forget. Because sometimes it takes the courage of one silenced voice to awaken 1,000 others. Mary had every reason to hate them. The Reverend Mother, who sentenced her to solitary prayers and freezing nights. The nuns who turned their backs on her, fed her dry bread like a criminal, and whispered cruel things behind her back. And worst of all, Father Isaac, the man cloaked in faith, who shattered her innocence, and then dared to mock her suffering. After months of being treated like a curse, Mary had every right to rise from the ashes with a hardened heart. But when the truth finally came out, when the convent walls shook with gasps of horror, and the sacred halls echoed with shame, it was not vengeance that Mary chose. It was forgiveness. And in doing so, she broke a chain of cruelty that had lingered far too long. Her body was weak, trembling from childbirth and malnutrition. But her voice, when she spoke, was unwavering. "I forgive you," she said to the very women who had cast her out, who now knelt before her in tears. It was not spoken with pride or drama. It was spoken with quiet strength, an act not of surrender, but of liberation. That single sentence cracked open hearts like thunder. Some wept openly. Others collapsed under the weight of their own guilt. And for Mary, the moment was not about their remorse. It was about her own release. She was done carrying their cruelty. She had a child now, a life to protect, and she would not let bitterness be part of it. In the days that followed, the atmosphere at Mount Carmel changed dramatically. It was as if Mary's forgiveness had lifted a veil from the eyes of those who remained. The cruel were gone, banished, arrested, or shunned. And in their place, compassion blossomed where judgment once reigned. Sister Anna, who had risked everything to believe Mary, became a guiding light. She helped lead the reform, ensuring the convent became a haven, not a prison. The other sisters followed, humbled and awakened. They scrubbed away the stains of injustice, not just from the floors, but from their hearts. They prayed not for power or punishment, but for grace and healing. And at the center of it all stood Mary, not a martyr, not a saint, but a mother with a quiet fire in her eyes. The child she carried through pain, through isolation, through threats and betrayal, he was the living proof of her strength. The cross-shaped birthmark on his chest, once thought to be a curse, now symbolized a second chance for everyone who had failed her. To Mary, he was not a sign from God or a divine punishment. He was simply her son, innocent, beautiful, and deserving of love. She rocked him in the chapel, where she had once been denied prayer. She fed him in the kitchen, where she had once been forbidden to eat. And every time someone looked at him with awe or guilt, she smiled and said, "He's just a child. Let him be." Mary's decision to leave the convent was not a rejection of her faith, but an act of deep faith in herself. She knew her mission there was complete. The truth had been revealed. The guilty had fallen, and those who remained had learned. Staying would mean continuing to relive the past, but walking away, that meant embracing a new beginning. Sister Anna met her at the gate on the morning of her departure. The sky was painted with early light, golden and soft, like a blessing. "Are you sure you want to go?" Anna asked, her voice filled with emotion. Mary nodded. "Yes, I want to raise my son in a world where love isn't punished." Their embrace was long and silent. They didn't need to say much. Sister Anna had been her savior, her friend, her only ally in the darkest moments. Mary whispered, "Thank you," before stepping beyond the stone gates, barefoot but unburdened. With every step, she shed a little more of the pain she had carried. The echoes of abuse faded behind her. Ahead was the unknown, but for once, it didn't feel scary. It felt like possibility. Back inside the convent, the nuns continued their transformation. They opened the doors to the poor, to the broken, to those seeking healing rather than judgment. The name Mary was spoken not in shame, but with reverence, not because she was divine, but because she reminded them all of what humanity meant. The Reverend Mother and Father Isaac were never mentioned again except in cautionary whispers, reminders of how power without compassion can rot even the holiest places. Mary's story rippled beyond Mount Carmel. Word spread of the nun who bore a child in silence, suffered alone, and yet forgave those who destroyed her. Some called it a miracle, others called it madness. But those who truly understood saw it for what it was. Courage. The courage to survive without hate. The courage to protect a child born of violence with nothing but love. The courage to walk away without bitterness. Years later, a young boy with a curious mind and a warm smile would sit by his mother's side, unaware of the storms she had endured. He wouldn't know the pain of the cold floor or the weight of injustice. Mary's story reminds us that even when the world condemns and power is abused under the cloak of holiness, light will eventually find its way in. The truth can be beaten down, buried, and called a lie, but it will rise. It always does. And those who have suffered in silence are not weak. They are warriors. Mary didn't just find her freedom, she earned it. One prayer, one tear, one breath at a time. And when she finally walked away, she didn't run. She walked, calm and steady, because she had nothing left to prove. She had already won. In life, we often witness that truth can be silenced, and injustice can wear the mask of virtue. But this story reminds us of a powerful truth. Even in the darkest corners, light can break through. Mary's journey was not just one of suffering, it was a testimony to the strength of the human spirit. She was shamed, silenced, and left to suffer alone, yet she never gave up. For many of us, especially in our later years, it is easy to look back and wonder if the battles we fought, the voices we raised, or the silence we endured had any meaning. But stories like Mary's show us that every quiet act of courage, every whispered prayer, and every tear we shed in solitude holds power. Sometimes, the world may take time to see what we already know in our hearts. But patience, coupled with integrity, often brings the truth to light. This story also reminds us of the strength found in forgiveness, not as surrender, but as a final act of peace. Mary's ability to forgive those who wronged her is a gentle call to all of us, to release the weight we've carried for years, to embrace freedom in our hearts, and to understand that justice sometimes arrives not with vengeance, but with quiet dignity. In the end, we learn that one does not need to be loud to be strong, nor perfect to be worthy of love and truth. For those of us who have lived long lives, this tale is a beautiful reminder. It is never too late to stand for what is right, to believe in goodness, and to begin again, no matter the pain, no matter the past. Thank you for watching this emotional journey on Stories TH. If this story moved you, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe. Your support helps us keep sharing stories that matter. Until next time.